My neighbor whispered one sentence I couldn't explain. I had just come home from a long deployment, and I was ready for an empty house and a quiet life. I had gotten good at not hoping for much more than that. There she was on her porch, with a warm smile, leaning in close to say the one thing I didn't expect. She told me not to lock my door that night. And over the days that followed, I started to notice small signs that someone had been looking after me the whole time I was gone. Let me paint the picture for you. It was late October, the kind of gray afternoon where the light gives up early and the leaves have turned but haven't quite let go. I'd been driving for hours, and the roads looked the same as the ones I'd left, which I suppose should have been a comfort. Instead, it made me feel like I'd been quietly erased for a while, and then set back down without anyone noticing I'd gone. I had spent a long time away, long enough that the silence had stopped feeling like a visitor and started feeling like a part of me. You learn to carry it on a deployment the same way you carry your gear. You stop expecting the world to make room for you, and you get good at fitting into small, empty spaces. That was what I told myself I was coming home to. A small, empty space I already knew how to fill with nothing. The truck rolled down Maple Street, past the same low fences and the same porches with their rocking chairs, and I noticed my hands were tight on a wheel. I remember thinking that was strange, because there was nothing out here to be afraid of. The worst thing on this street was a dog that barked too much, and a man 2 doors down who took his leaves too seriously. But my body had its own memory, and it hadn't been told yet that the war was over for me, so it stayed braced. I'd driven through the old part of town on the way in, past the diner and the feed store and the church with the crooked sign, and none of it had greeted me the way I'd wanted it to. The places were all still there, but they'd gone on without me, the way places do. And I felt like a man walking back into a room where the party had moved on to a joke he'd missed. That was the strangest part of coming home. Not that things had changed, but that they hadn't, and that I had. I pulled into my drive and sat there a full minute with the engine running. The house looked tired, the paint a little more faded than I remembered, the gutters sagging at one corner, the porch light dark. It was mine, and I was glad of that, but glad had become a small, quiet word in my chest over the years. I didn't feel much of anything bigger anymore, and I had made my peace with that the way you make peace with weather. I was wrong about all of it. I killed the engine, and the silence rushed in to fill the space the motor had left. That was the first real sound of home, the absence of sound. And I sat with it the way you sit with an old friend you don't have to talk to. The smell came next, leaves and cold air, and something faintly metallic, the way a closed-up house smells even from the outside. I told myself this was just the start of a long, ordinary, uneventful life, and that ordinary was exactly what I'd asked for. I took my bag from the passenger seat, the same duffel I'd carried across too many airports, and I walked up the 3 porch steps. The third one creaked the way it always had, and that small, familiar sound did something to me I wasn't ready for. It reached into a part of me I'd locked away, and for half a second I was just a man coming home from work, expecting a light on and a meal waiting. Then I remembered there was no one inside to leave a light on, and the feeling folded itself up and went quiet again. I put the key in the lock and the door swung in. The air inside was still and cool and held the flat smell of a house that had been shut too long. Dust and nothing and the ghost of old coffee. I set my bag down by the door and stood in my own kitchen and felt the size of the quiet. It was bigger than I'd remembered, and it pressed against me from every side. I stayed there long enough to know I couldn't stay there, and then I turned around and walked back out onto the porch to breathe. That's where I saw her. The porch next door sat close to mine, just a low fence and a few feet of yard between us. I looked at that porch 1,000 times, but I hadn't expected anyone to be on it. There she was, standing at the railing like she'd been waiting for the sound of my truck. And when I turned her way, she lifted her hand in a small, easy wave. She was a brunette, and she had the kind of warm smile that reaches the eyes before it reaches the mouth. I'd known her in the way you know a neighbor for a few years before I left, and I'd thought about her more than I'd ever let on. Her name was Evelyn, and she moved with a stillness that put the rest of the world a little more at ease. I hadn't let myself think about her much while I was gone, because thinking about her had started to feel like hoping, and I'd given up hoping for a while. I lifted my hand back and tried to look like a man who had it together. She came down her steps and walked over to the low fence, and I walked over to meet her there. We stood with the fence between us the way we always had, She looked at me for a long moment without saying anything, the way a person does when they're checking whether you're really all the way back. She said it was good to see me, and I said it was good to be seen. We talked a little, the way neighbors do, about the drive and the weather and how the street had gotten a new dog that barked at everything. It was the kind of easy talk that means more than it says, and I felt something in my chest loosen for the first time in a long while. I kept my face easy because I'd gotten good at that, but part of me wanted to sit on that fence and talk to her until the dark came. She asked how I was, and I said I was fine, which is what you say when you don't know yet how you are. She didn't push, and I was grateful for that, because the people who push mean well, but they make the walls go up faster. She just stood with me in the cold and let the quiet be part of the conversation, and that was the thing I'd missed most without knowing it. I noticed her coat was thin for the weather, and I noticed I wanted to tell her to go inside before she got cold, and I noticed I didn't say it because it would have sounded like more than I was ready to admit. Then she leaned in a little closer, and her voice dropped, and she said one thing that didn't fit the rest of the conversation at all. She said, "Don't lock your door tonight." She said it low, almost like a secret, and then she pulled back and smiled at me like she'd just told me where she'd hidden a birthday present. I stood there, holding the sentence, trying to find the part of it that made sense. I started to ask her what she meant, but something in her face told me she wasn't going to explain. She just held the smile, soft and sure, and after a second she said she'd let me settle in, and she turned and walked back to her porch. I watched her go, and I realized my hands had gone still at my sides, and my chest was doing something it hadn't done in a long time. I was curious, and curious was a feeling I thought I'd packed away for good. I went back inside, carrying that one sentence like a stone in my pocket, turning it over, unable to let it go. I kept the porch light off that night, the dark one, because part of me wanted to see if the new bulb was really there. I told myself I was checking the wiring. I wasn't. I was checking whether someone had really thought of me, and that was a thing I'd stopped letting myself wonder about a long time ago. The first thing I did was walk through every room, the way you do when you've been away too long and need to confirm the place is still yours. I flipped on lights and opened curtains and let the gray afternoon in. The house was exactly as I'd left it, and it was not exactly as I'd left it, and it took me a few rooms to figure out why the kitchen was the first wrong thing, the good kind of wrong. The fridge was running, and when I opened it, was stocked with the plain basics, eggs and milk and bread, and a stick of butter, and a few apples in a bowl. I hadn't left it that way. I'd left it empty and unplugged, the door propped open so it wouldn't smell, and I remembered doing it because I remembered thinking I might not come back to it at all. I stood in front of that open fridge for a long time. The cold air pushed against my face, and I tried to find the ordinary explanation that maybe my brother had done it, or the old man 2 doors down who had a key for emergencies. But my brother lived 3 states away and didn't have a key, and the old man didn't either, because I'd never given one to anyone. The porch light was the second thing. I noticed it dark when I pulled in, but when I flipped the switch that night, a new bulb burned, warm and steady. The old one had been out for months before I left, and I'd kept meaning to change it and never had. Someone had climbed my porch steps and changed a bulb for me, and they hadn't done it so I'd know. They'd done it so the light would be ready when I came home. I found the note on the kitchen table, tucked under a salt shaker so it wouldn't blow away. It was small, torn from a notepad, and the handwriting was careful and a little slanted. It said 2 words, "Welcome home." There was no name on it and no signature, and I held it for a long time and tried to make my hand stay steady. The floors were the last thing I noticed, and they shouldn't have been. I'd left them dusty, because I'd been in a hurry and because I'd figured I'd get to them later. Now they were clean, swept, and damp mopped, and the corners were done the way only someone who cared would do them. I stood in my hallway and looked at those clean floors and felt the size of what had been done for me, and it was bigger than a bulb or a fridge. It was a year of someone choosing, week after week, to keep my place alive when I couldn't. And I hadn't earned a bit of it. I should tell you that I tried hard to make all of this small. I told myself someone was just being neighborly, the way people are on a quiet street, and that it didn't have to mean anything bigger. I told myself I didn't deserve to let it mean anything bigger, because I hadn't been here to earn it. I set the note back under the salt shaker, and told my chest to stop doing what it was doing. But the house didn't feel the way I'd expected it to feel. I had braced for dust and dead air, and a flat smell of a life that had paused. Instead, the floors were clean. The air had been moved, and there were fresh flowers in a jar on the windowsill, the small autumn kind that grow along a fence line. Someone had been in my house more than once, and they had done it quietly, and they had done it for me. I sat at my own table with the note in front of me, and I didn't lock the door that night because she'd asked me not to, and I realized I wanted to find out why. I couldn't sleep, so I sat in the dark kitchen and let myself remember her, which was something I hadn't let myself do in a long time. We had been neighbors for 3 years before I left, and in that time she had become the part of my day I looked forward to without admitting it. It had started small, the way these things do. She waved from her porch the morning I moved in, and I waved back, and that was the whole of it for a while. Then one afternoon, my lawnmower died halfway through the yard, and she walked over with a plate of cookies in one hand and her mower's gas can in the other. She said she'd heard it sputtering from her kitchen window, and she'd figured I'd rather have the gas than the lecture. We stood in my half-mowed yard and laughed, and I remember thinking that was the first time the place had felt like it could be home. There was a storm the next summer, the kind that comes up fast and turns the sky green at the edges. Her gutters overflowed and flooded her basement, and I saw her out in it with a bucket and a look on her face that said she had it handled even if she didn't. I went over anyway, and we bailed her basement for 2 hours in the dark, knee-deep in cold water, laughing about how bad we were at it. When it was done, she made coffee on a camp stove because her power was out, and we sat on her porch, dripping onto her floor, and she said she was glad the storm had come. I asked why, and she said it was the first time all week she'd sat still. I didn't understand that then. I understand it now. After that, the fence between our yards became a kind of meeting place. I'd be out working on something, and she'd be out working on something, and we'd end up leaning on the fence, talking about nothing that mattered and everything that did. She told me about her work and her garden and the book she was reading, and I told her about the truck and the weather and the things I was fixing. I never told her the thing I most wanted to, which was that I looked forward to the sound of her screen door. There were holidays, too. She brought over a plate at Thanksgiving, just a few slices of pie, and a note that said the neighborhood shouldn't eat alone. At Christmas, she left a small bag on my porch with coffee and a pair of thick socks, and the card said for the cold mornings. She never made a thing of any of it. She had a gift for showing up without making you feel like you owed her. And I noticed that about her the way you notice the weather without thinking to name it. I noticed other things, too, that I kept to myself. I noticed the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was thinking, and the way she talked to her garden, like it could hear her. I noticed that she was the one people on the street called when something needed doing, and that she did it without ever making a fuss. And I noticed, more than I should have, that when she smiled at me across the fence, it was the kind of smile that made me want to stay in one place for the rest of my life. That was the problem, in the end. I wanted to stay, and I was afraid that wanting, it wasn't enough, and that I didn't have it in me to be what someone like her deserved. So, when the orders came, I said yes, and I packed my bag. And I walked out my door without knocking on hers. I told myself I was doing her a favor, leaving before I could disappoint her. I told myself a lot of things that year, and most of them were lies I needed to get through the days. But here is the part I never expected. The lies I told myself were about to come apart, one small kindness at a time, and I wasn't going to be able to stop it. The next morning I stepped out to get the paper, and there was a paper bag on my porch I hadn't left there. Inside were a few garden tomatoes still warm, with a little dirt on them, and a note that said, "From the garden. Hope you're hungry." I stood on my porch in the early cold and held those tomatoes like they were something breakable. And I looked over at her house, and the curtains were drawn. That was the start of a week of small kindnesses that kept finding me the way rain finds a roof. A day later, after a hard rain, I came home from the hardware store and found my gutters cleared, the leaves raked into a neat pile at the corner of the yard. The sagging corner had been fixed too, propped and rehung, and the work was clean and careful. I hadn't mentioned the gutters to a soul. The pie came 2 days after that. It sat on my porch in the afternoon, a simple one, with a note that said, "For the table." No name, the same careful slanted hand, and I was starting to know that hand the way you know a person's voice. I brought it inside and set it on the counter and stood there a long time, because it occurred to me that no one had put a pie on my counter in years, and the smallness of that fact hit me harder than I expected. It undid me a little. By the third evening, I had run out of ways to pretend it was random. I found myself watching for her, and when she came out to water her porch plants, I walked over to the fence. We talked the way we used to, easy and slow, and it was like picking up a conversation that had been left open on a page. She asked me nothing hard, and she let the silences sit without rushing to fill them, and that was a kindness I hadn't known I'd missed. One evening, she told me about her father, who'd come home from his own war when she was small and never quite settled after. She said he'd been a good man who'd lost the ease of being home, and that she'd grown up learning to read the difference between a man who was there and a man who was trying to be there. She said it without pity, the way she said everything, and I knew she was talking about more than her father. I wanted to tell her I was trying. Instead, I told her the tomatoes were the best I'd ever eaten, and she laughed, and the sound of it did something to me I hadn't let a sound do in a long time. Over those evenings, I learned a little about her life while I'd been gone. She'd kept an eye on the whole street, not only my house, and she was the one people called when a pipe burst, or a dog got loose, or an old man needed a ride to the doctor. She did it the way she did everything, without making a show of it, and the street ran a little better because of her, and barely knew it. I let my guard down in inches that week, and it scared me a little because I'd gotten good at being closed. I caught myself looking forward to the evening, and to the sound of her screen door, and to the small gifts I pretended not to wait for. And I caught something else too that was harder to sit with. I caught myself hoping, and I'd told myself I was done with that, and here it was again, quiet and stubborn, like a green shoot coming up through concrete. That hope scared me enough that I almost pulled back. For a day, I was short with her at the fence, and I didn't go out when I heard her screen door, and I told myself I was protecting us both. She noticed, the way she noticed everything, and she didn't chase me. She just left a small jar of honey on my porch with no note at all, and that was worse than a note, because it meant she understood exactly what I was doing, and she wasn't going to make it easy for me to keep doing it. I stood with that jar in my hand and felt small, and then I felt something better, which was ready. All of that kindness forced me to face the thing I'd been running from, which was why I'd left without a word in the first place. I owe you the truth of it, because the rest of this story doesn't make sense without it. I didn't leave because I didn't feel it. I left because I felt it too much, and I didn't trust myself to offer her anything worth staying for. I'd watched too many good men come back from deployments different, quieter, easier to startle, harder to reach, and I didn't want to hand her a worn-down version of a person and call it a husband. I thought I was protecting her. What I was really doing was protecting myself from the chance that she'd see me clearly and decide I wasn't enough. I wrote her a letter the night before I left. I sat at this same kitchen table and tried to say the thing, and I filled a page and a half, and then I folded it up and put it in the drawer beside my bed. I told myself I'd send it when I was settled, and then I told myself I'd send it when I was better, and then I stopped telling myself anything and just let the letter sit. It's still in that drawer. I checked the first night back, and the corner was soft where I'd handled it more than I admitted. I can tell you what the letter said, because I've read it 100 times. It said that I was sorry to leave without saying anything, and that I didn't have the right words, and that if I came home and she was still on that porch, I'd come straight over and tell her the thing out loud. I wrote all of that and meant none of it, because I'd already decided I wouldn't come straight over, and I'd already decided the thing would stay in the drawer. It's strange the way we make promises to ourselves that we know, even as we make them, we're going to break. I carried her face with me the whole time I was gone. I want to say that plainly, because I spent a year pretending it was just memory. It was her face in the quiet hours, and her laugh in the space between two tasks, and the thought of her porch light when the dark got too big. I told myself it was habit, the way you tell yourself a cough is nothing, and I kept telling myself that until I almost believed it. Here is the part I had to admit to myself that week. Sitting at my table with her pie and her tomatoes and her careful notes, most of what I called being good at not hoping was just being afraid. I had dressed fear up in sturdy words like duty and discipline and not wanting to be a burden, and I'd let those words stand between me and a life for a long time. The kindness on my porch was pulling those words down, one small gift at a time, and I didn't know whether to be grateful or terrified. I decided, that night, that I owed her the truth. I owed it to her because she had spent a year keeping my house alive, and because she had done it without asking for anything, and because the least I could do was stop hiding behind the silence I'd chosen. I didn't know yet what her whispered request meant, but I knew I was going to have to say the thing I'd carried for a year, and the thought of it made my hands shake in a way no deployment ever had. I went to her porch the next evening, when the light was soft and the street was quiet. She was already there, sitting in her chair with a mug in her hands, and she looked up at me like she'd been expecting me for a while. I sat in the chair beside hers, the one she'd left open, and for a little while we just watched the evening come on. I asked her plainly what she'd meant. I said I'd been turning it over for days, and I couldn't let it go, and that I needed to understand. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she set her mug down, and she told me in her unhurried way, the way this voice says big things, with room around them to breathe. While I was gone, she told me, she had kept my house like it was part of hers. She'd walked over once a week and opened the windows and swept the floors and checked the pipes, and she'd stocked the fridge the day she heard I was coming home. She'd changed the porch light because she couldn't bear the thought of me pulling up to a dark house. She said it all simply the way she said everything, like it was the most ordinary thing in the world to care for a house that wasn't hers. She told me she'd worried about the pipes in the first winter when the cold snap came early, and that she'd let herself in with the spare key I'd left with the old man 2 doors down before I knew I'd be gone a year. I hadn't remembered leaving a key, but I had, and I'd forgotten, and she hadn't. The first winter, she sat in my kitchen once, with a cup of her own coffee at my table, just to keep the house from feeling abandoned. It had felt like the right thing to do, she said, and she'd done it every week after. And somewhere in there, it had stopped being a favor and started being a promise she'd made to a house and to a man who didn't know she'd made it. Then she told me the rest of it. The request had been her way of saying she wanted to be there when I came home, really there, and that she hadn't wanted a locked door between us anymore. She'd been waiting, she said, and she hadn't wanted to push, and she'd hoped I'd come to her when I was ready, but she'd also been willing to come to me if I wasn't. The whisper was because some things are too tender to say loud, she said, and because she'd wanted me to know it mattered before she ever said a word. I sat with that for a long time. The street was dark by then, and the only light was her porch lamp and the one she'd fixed on mine. I understood finally that the whisper had been an invitation, and that I'd been invited a long time before the porch. I understood that the tomatoes and the gutters and the pie and the unsigned notes had all been the same sentence, said over and over in a language she'd hoped I'd learn. I'd been slow to learn it. So I said the thing I'd carried for a year. I told her I'd written a letter and never sent it, and that I'd left without a word, because I was afraid I wasn't enough, and that I'd thought about her every day I was gone, and called it something else. I told her I was sorry for the silence, and that I was done being afraid, and that I didn't want to come home to a quiet life if it didn't have her in it. I said it all at once, the way you pull off a bandage, and my voice shook on the last of it. She didn't look away. She reached over and put her hand on mine, and she said 4 words that undid a year of hiding. She said she already knew. She'd known before I left, she said, and she'd kept my house because she'd been keeping a place for me, and she'd waited because she knew I'd have to come home to it on my own. She was glad I was finally here, she said, and she'd had the porch light on the whole time. That was the night she'd asked me about, the one I'd spent a week not understanding. I left my door unlatched on purpose, the way she'd asked, and then I sat at my kitchen table and waited in the quiet. I was nervous, which surprised me because I'd been nervous about bigger things and handled them fine. This was different. This was the kind of nervous that means you care how it ends. Her knock is soft, the way she's soft. 3 small taps, like she was checking first whether the door was really open. I called out for her to come in, and the door swung wide, and there she was, in my kitchen, with a dish in her hands, and a smile that reached her eyes. She'd brought a simple meal, the kind of ordinary care that means more than any grand thing, and she set it on the table like she'd been setting tables in this house for years. We ate together at my table, the first meal in that house that felt like home in a long time. The food was warm and plain and good, and the kitchen smelled like someone's cooking instead of dust, and her voice filled the rooms the way I'd imagined it could. I watched her across the table and felt something I'd forgotten the name of, which was belonging. It's a quiet word, belonging, but it holds a whole life inside it. The kitchen is warm and the light is low, and her voice moves through the rooms like it has always lived here. She tells me about the year while I was gone, the small things, the garden and the street, and the dog that still barks too much, and I tell her about the letter in the drawer and the face I carried. We talk the way people talk when they're done pretending, slow and honest, with room for the hard parts. The plates are almost empty before I notice I've stopped being hungry, because hunger left somewhere in the middle of the meal and something steadier took its place. And somewhere in the middle of it, she reaches across the table and takes my hand, and I let her, and I don't pull away. And that small not pulling away is the biggest thing I've done in years. The kitchen light is low, and the house is warm for the first time since I came back, and her hand in mine is steady. She doesn't say much after that, and neither do I. And the quiet between us is a different quiet than the one I came home to. This one has a shape to it, a warmth, like a room with a fire in it. I used to think silence was the thing you filled. Tonight I learn it can be the thing you share. I kept waiting for the catch, for the part where the good thing turned out to be temporary, the way I'd trained myself to expect. It didn't come. The evening just went on, easy and ordinary, and I sat in it and let the warmth in. And I stopped bracing for the emptiness I'd been sure was waiting for me. I don't need to tell you everything that was said. Some things are a person's own. What I can tell you is that when she finally got up to go, she stopped at the door and looked back at me. And I knew I was home, and not because of the house. The light she'd fixed on my porch burned behind her, and the door between us was open, and I understood that it had been open the whole year on her side, whether I'd known it or not. I used to think coming home was about the house, the porch, the third step that creaks, the kitchen where the light falls a certain way in the afternoon. I thought home was the place you returned to, and that the rest of it was luck you couldn't count on. I came back from deployment expecting an empty house and a quiet life, and I'd gotten good at not hoping for more than that. What I found was a porch light someone had changed so I wouldn't come home to the dark, a fridge someone had filled, a note that said 2 words and meant a whole year, a neighbor who had kept my house like it was hers because, to her, it had started to be. I spent a week telling myself it was small, and it was never small. It was the biggest thing that had ever been done for me, and it was done quietly, the way real love is done, without a sign on the door announcing it. I almost missed it. I learned something this autumn that I want to leave with you. Home isn't always a house you come back to. Sometimes it's a person who waited for you to come back, who kept the light on and the door open and the place alive, and who never once asked you to hurry. I came home from deployment to a person, not a place, and the door I'd been locking for years was the one around my own heart. I think about that sometimes, the doors we lock without meaning to, and the people who wait on the other side of them anyway. She never once stopped knocking, even when she did it so quietly I couldn't hear. The porch light still burns every night now, hers and mine, 2 warm lights on a quiet street. If my story warmed your heart, leave a comment below and tell me which moment stayed with you longest.